Bit of housekeeping. We have emergency exits here and behind you at the back. And if there is an alarm, we're not scheduled to have any practices, so please do make your way calmly to the exits and then out into the garden, which is lovely. So thank you very much. Which I'm very grateful for you coming on such a sunny evening. 20 years ago, we had Labour governments running England, running Scotland, running Wales, and by direct rule, running Northern Ireland. But things are rather different now. Last week, the Sinn Féin, Irish nationalists, First Minister of Northern Ireland, told her party conference that the union is cracking at the seams. John Swinney, First Minister of Scotland from the Scottish National Party, is committed to pushing for independence as soon as this election in Scotland is over. Wales may well be on course to have a First Minister from Plaid Cymru after the election. And England, meanwhile, is turning to Nigel Farage, a politician who's only grudgingly accepted devolution and pushes policies rather at odds with those of the nationalists in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Now, to help us understand what's going on in politics in England, Scotland and Wales, I'm delighted to be welcoming this panel, which is a dream team, so I'm very, very grateful for them coming. We have Oxford's own Professor Jane Green, who's going to talk about public opinion in England and political trends in Britain more broadly. Then Professor Sir John Curtice will be speaking about Scotland before turning to Wales. Then, hopefully, we'll have down the line from Westminster, Ben Lake. He was hoping to join us, but there's an interesting vote on the Prime Minister's future going on that he's required to vote for. So hopefully he'll be able to join us down the line at that point. After that, Stephen Bush from the Financial Times will be sharing his thoughts on what the previous speakers have said and more broadly. We are recording the event, so please don't interrupt the speakers. But when we come to Q&A, there will be somebody, Elizabeth, with a microphone. Please wait for the microphone before asking your question, so that the people who watch the recording can hear your question. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Steve. Thank you very much to Steve for having the Dream Team. I'm very honoured to be here with John and with Stephen and, of course, with Steve and with Ben when he comes. Right. I want to talk about the rejection of the two largest parties. And Steve asked me to talk mainly about England and about Great British trends as a whole. But I just want to preface John's remarks, if I may, by saying you can't understand what's happening in Scotland and in Wales without really thinking about this as a decline of Labour and the Tories. That's what lowers the bar that makes it possible for us to have so much change, lowering the threshold for other parties to overcome those. So I think this is going to be the topic of these elections when we're talking about them on May the 8th, the rejection of Labour and the Conservatives. Now, there's lots that could be said about this, but I want to make two key points. And the first key point is, the second key point is going to be about this order. So we're going to be talking about, first of all, fragmentation, so the splitting of people's votes towards challenger parties, and then we're going to be talking about the structure that actually exists below the surface. Now, it's really important to think about this structure, because if you think the other alternative is to think that this is chaotic, volatile, anything could happen, anyone can seize on that politically and say, well, it's just a matter of time before there's all kinds of change in British politics. But there's a very clear structure going on in this, what otherwise appears to be quite a chaotic and volatile mix. Now, this is Marta, and she's very embarrassed, but she's sitting at the top. And I wanted to just mention that this is Marta and I working on a major project for the next 2 to 3, maybe 4 years, where we're looking at fragmentation, volatility, and viability. And so I wanted to credit Marta because she's made beautiful graphs for you all to see. So thank you very much, Marta. And she's also, of course, helping me think about all of these things. Right. So first of all, I want to talk about national level and and council level fragmentation that we're likely to see in these May elections. Now, we can think about, time as a kind of a crucial contextual variable here. So this graph takes us back to the 2019 general election and just shows us polls. This is GB-wide polls or UK-wide polls, the average of polls. Now there's 2 lines vertical, well there's 3 vertical lines, but the 2 important vertical lines here are the 2022, this is why I wanted a mic where I can wander around. So this line, this is the last time the local elections were fought, primarily. There were some that were delayed, but primarily 2022 May, this is the last time they were fought. And actually what you can see, of course, is that Labour and the Conservatives have lost lots of support in that period. So that's why we're talking about the decline or the challenge to the 2 largest parties. This dotted line here, that's the 2024 general election. And so since 2024, you see this very distinctive pattern change. It's not really a pattern, is it? It's a noisy kind of, splintering of support across those 5 parties. And of course, I hope that you've worked out that this is the Greens, the Lib Dems, the Tories, Labour, and Reform UK. Now, Reform UK have fallen back a little bit from where they were just at the turn of the year, but nevertheless, of course, they're doing loads better than they were in 2022 when these council elections were fought. And so we're in this context of a very, very fragmented race, and you can see that it's the lowering of that threshold that means that the Greens start to become within touching distance. And you see parties there vying for 2 or 3rd or 4th place. So, local election results help us understand how those polls translate into votes in local elections. And Steve and his team and John will create a measure of the projected national share. I was being very loyal to ITV here by using the national equivalent vote, partly because we've also been creating an explainer using these graphs for ITV, so that made more sense. But what that does is tells you if the local elections were happening across the whole of the country, what the shares of the parties would have been. And as you can see, the Conservatives essentially are tracking that trend. They're a national equivalent vote in local elections are the dots, and the line is still that polling share. So of course we're expecting to see a decline for the Tories. Labour, on the other hand, have actually underperformed in local elections relative to their polling share. And that's not just because it's the Labour Party, it's because Labour's the party of government. And also Labour has this challenge from other parties on the left, which are able to really squeeze Labour's votes. If you think you've got the Lib Dems and the Greens on the left able to squeeze Labour's votes. I'm not talking about the SNP implied because I wanted to leave that to John, but it's a similar picture. So that's the Labour Party. Now, these challenger parties, we see them polling here. And if you compare these to the national equivalent vote, another striking thing is the Reform UK were hardly standing candidates anywhere in 2022, 2023, and even 2024. And so their gains are really effectively from nothing when they, whatever they gain, according to their polling share in 2026. And crucially, in 2025, we could add a line here. Last May, Reform, it was the first time they managed to transform, therefore, because they stood candidates in loads more places, their polling share was so much higher that they were able to translate that support not only into votes, but also crucially into seats. And so they were the top party in terms of that votes to seats relationship, and they managed to break through this big efficiency barrier, which meant they could translate their votes into seats more effectively. And that's a huge thing for a challenger party to be able to do. And of course, they can do it because they were frankly in the lead. So that's the fragmentation that is happening in the context of these elections that are taking place next week. And that's why you'll hear so many people saying these are our expectations. So what do we know is that this fragmentation isn't new, however. But this much fragmentation certainly is new. And just to give you a bit of context for how much change there's been in British elections over time, we can go back to 1970. These are general elections. And here we have almost everybody voting for the Labour or the Conservative Party in that general election, like 90% of the electorate. Now, if you go down that line, you'll see that that's fallen almost election on election. 2017, 2019, the Brexit elections, it goes up again. And that meant last year in May that many people were saying, oh, there's so much fragmentation. And actually, those of us who understood that this was a trend that had been in train for some time were saying, well, no, remember 2015. Remember, this was a process that was in train long beforehand. But this red line here, that is the combined share in the polls right now. So that's not obviously a vote share, a real vote share, but it's the combined share for Labour and the Conservatives in the polls. And what that tells you, this isn't a general election, of course, that could go up a bit in a general election, but what that tells you is that something really important is changing. Right? This fragmentation is very, very distinctly different and bigger than we've seen before. The fact that this is a long-term trend helps us understand that there's not just the current political landscape that's creating this fragmentation. There are trends, big sort of structural shifts in the electorate that are also contributing to this kind of decline in support for the two largest parties. One of those is the fall in partisanship, and there's we could talk about that for a long time. But John knows that because we wrote a book about it, or slightly about it anyway. So we have this very important fragmentation context in which these elections are taking place. And like I said at the beginning, this can feel kind of bewildering, right? Like, it's like, what the hell's going to happen? And you'll hear people, because essentially a party swings can, very, very big changes in seats can happen on very small vote share changes. And so you've got a party that only has to be 1 or 2%. The margin is very, very small for lots of seats to fall to different parties. And so it feels very, very volatile, and indeed it is, relatively speaking, very volatile. However, that implication, first of all, is that we can see that the locals are clearly an outlet, right, for disillusionment against the major parties. But I want to move on to the structure that's underneath this. And Justin Robinson and Zach Grant were also coming here. If they are here, I just want to name check them. Hey, guys. So we've been doing work for the last kind of 2 years. And one of the things that we have observed is that, one of the crucial contexts here is the economy acts as a really effective kind of push factor, certainly away from the government, and to some degree also the Conservatives still in opposition. And so what we have there is financial worries as a push factor, pushing voters away from those two largest parties. But what we also see is that there's a very clear structure to where voters are going. So if you imagine that, people are annoyed, disillusioned, fed up, worried about the state of the country and their finances, and then looking for a party that's closer to them ideologically as some kind of protest or a sincere preference in terms of what they prefer, also seeing those parties as more viable. And one of the reasons these elections are so important is they're yet another signal that voting for a challenger party is not necessarily as wasted a vote in our electoral system as it has sometimes, as is often thought to be. But if you think about the structure that's going on here, what we see is two kind of ideological blocks. And we can put our left parties into one block, Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, Plaid Cymru, and also the SNP. And we can put Conservatives and Reform into a right block. And think of these as kind of we call it a sorting mechanism, right? You're disillusioned, you want to go somewhere. Which party's closest to me? Probably older voters still more leaning to the right, younger voters still more leaning to the left, going to parties within their block. And that helps us understand that fragmentation isn't random, right? It's not kind of as chaotic as it looks. So there are two sides or two blocks. Now, going back to 2024 to 2026, this is a graph of people, right? This is using YouGov data that they get very kindly shared with us, just collected very recently in April, and it compares people who voted in 2024, and it shows where those people have gone. And it looks bonkers, doesn't it? I mean, it looks really, really, really amazing. I love these graphs because you look at them, and if you compare them to the olden times, it's just nothing like this at all. So it's really striking visually. But it's hard to make sense of, right? So you've got Labour votes, the red here, going up to Labour, going to the Lib Dems, going to don't know or others or I wouldn't vote. You've got the Conservative vote splintering, you've got Labour vote splintering, you've got some Reform voters going to other or don't know, you've got the Greens. And so it's a very busy picture. However, what we can do is we can say, well, how much of that switching is essentially within one ideological side? And that helps us understand the fragmentation that's going on. So now what we're going to do is we're going to just say, right, anybody who voted for a left party, Labour, the Lib Dems, the Greens, or the SNP or Plaid, how are they voting now? Are they still voting for a left party, or are they switching to a right party? And then if you voted for a right party, Conservatives or Reform, are you still voting for a party within your bloc, within your side? And indeed, that's what we mostly see. So if you were a left voter in 2024, you've pretty much stayed with the left. You might have moved to don't know, I maybe won't vote, but only a small fraction has moved to the right. And it's important still to bear in mind that Labour's vote was relatively low in 2024, so losing any votes is terrible, right, from a very low base, despite a large majority. But you've got this very clear structure to that switching. Very clear block-based structure, left voters going to left parties. And so what we think is going on is, very clearly a sense of, well, I don't want to vote for that party, but I can't shift to the other side because that's, not within my sort of preferences, my choice set. But now I might have a party that's more viable within my bloc. And now I can vote for that party. And perhaps, it's not just a tactical consideration. Finally, I get to vote Green. No, I'm not saying me. But finally, someone might think, I can now vote Green because not only do I prefer to vote Green, but now the Greens have a chance. And so that's what we're seeing. And then on the right, it's even clearer still. And that makes lots of sense for various reasons. Hardly anybody who voted on the right in 2024 has moved to a party in the left bloc. So what you're seeing is very, very clear organisation to that fragmentation. And what does that mean for the local elections on May the 8th? I'm looking at Steve, he's telling me to wrap up. That was the cue, so I'm broadly on time, right? So the implication of this is very highly fragmented outcomes, but understand this within two clear, still political sides. And of course, there are areas where different right or left parties, mainly left parties, will do better locally. So we'd expect the Greens to do very well in London, relatively speaking, in other areas of their respective strengths. We'll still expect the Lib Dems to do fairly well, even though their polling support is quite stable. Stable's quite a good thing when you've got 72 MPs off your stable vote share in 2024. And so you can expect to see choices, still organised in those political sides, but different parties within those blocs doing better across England and indeed also in Scotland and Wales. But there's a really important question here, and it's one that we can't answer, and that is what we're seeing a sort of irreversible shift away from the two largest parties, or will people go back to, and I put in inverted commas, the safety of the familiar two traditional parties of government in a general election, when frankly people haven't seen them as particularly safe. That's me done. Thank you.
Okay, from the familiar to the unfamiliar. Quick introduction to politics north of the border and then to the west of Offa's Dyke. So, difficult though it is to remember, yes, the SNP were first in Scotland, indeed has been in every election since 2007, and to that extent at least, the fragmentation of British politics is already relatively ancient news north of the border. However, the Conservatives were second in 2021 when the last Holyrood election was held, and Labour came a rather miserable third. Quite a lot has happened since then. The Labour Party north of the border rose in the wake of Partygate and the Liz Truss fiscal event in exactly the same way as it did south of the border, but it then was further boosted by the difficulties that the SNP got into in the wake of Nicola Sturgeon's resignation in February 2023 and the rather difficult tenure of Humza Yousaf as party leader and First Minister. And of course, in the 2024 election at Westminster, the SNP found themselves behind the Labour Party by 5 points. The Labour Party became once again the dominant party for Scotland at Westminster, and you could smell Scottish Labour folk smelling and measuring up the curtains and the carpets of Bute House, which is the Downing Street of Edinburgh. You don't see them doing that now. These are the current opinion polls in Scotland for the Holyrood election. First point to note is actually now the most recent poll that came out yesterday. It's now 36 for the SNP. But the first point to note is the SNP is not a lot more popular than it was 2 years ago when they lost. But now they're ahead. They're well ahead. Why? Fragmentation again, right? And again, it's particularly Reform that are responsible because basically Reform have been taking votes primarily off the Tories from 2024 vote, also from Labour. They're taking more from Labour than they are south of the border. And as a result, that's helped to ensure that the Tories are already, frankly, already in a poor state in 2024. They are now in a very weak position. And Reform are vying with Labour for second place in Holyrood. But crucially, they've taken virtually nobody away from those who voted for the SNP in 2024. Ergo, we have the SNP a long way ahead. At this point, people go, how is it possible that a government that's been in power for nearly 20 years, and shall we say has a debatable record, is still going to manage to seemingly win the election? Well, of course, the answer is it's not because they're doing well, it's because their opponents are also doing badly, right? That support for the SNP is between 11 and 13 points down on what it was in 2021, but so is also support for the Conservatives, who came second. Even the Labour Party, which did pretty badly in 2021, their votes down a bit. So yes, it really is the challenges. It's Reform, of course, for whom it's all gain. It's the Greens, who are also seemingly heading for their best result yet in a Scottish Parliament election, although ignore the constituency figure, because the Greens are only going to fight 6 of the constituencies, and Liberal Democrats are recovering from what was a very weak performance in 2021. So, crucial point, therefore, to note is that Scottish politics is also replicating the fragmentation that Jane has already talked about south of the border. Why are Labour in so much trouble? Well, I could spend many hours talking about this, but frankly, this tells you probably all you need to know. Anna Sarwar thinks if we persuade people to focus on the Scottish government's record and ignore the record of the UK government at Westminster, all will be fine and dandy. Their scales will be taken away from their eyes, and they will realise that they do not want the SNP in power any longer. The trouble is that the much diminished, and admittedly much diminished, number of people who are willing to vote for the SNP now think that the Scottish government's doing quite a good job. Thank you very much. Right? Those are the SNP voters in the red bloc. The blue bloc is what people in Scotland in general say. People in Scotland think both governments are crap. But at least the SNP supporters think that the Scottish government's doing a good job. And they say that's what they're voting on. So Anna Sarwar doesn't get anywhere by trying to make that argument. And meanwhile, this is the cross he bears, even the folk who voted for Labour in 2024 north of the border think that the UK government is doing really badly. And that is just so impossible for the Labour Party to escape north of the border. So essentially, therefore, we are talking about the SNP, much diminished in numbers, but apparently heading to be well ahead. But it's thanks to the difficulties of their opponents, not because of their own particular attributes, other than to those who were already still faithful. Meanwhile, the other thing you need to know about Scotland is that half the country wants to leave and only half wants to stay. There has been no fundamental change in that since 2024. Labour thought that once there was a nice, quote-unquote, Labour government at Westminster, rather than a nasty Conservative government at Westminster, that people in Scotland would say, well, we no longer need to worry about independence. It's now all fine and dandy. Absolutely nothing has happened. You can see, you don't have to work out which line is which. They're basically two power lines, and basically one is sometimes a bit higher than the other. It's basically 50-50, and that's what it's actually been now ever since 2019. What is also true is it's commonly said, And voters don't care about the independence question anymore. This peculiarly comes primarily from unionist commentators. Tell that to the average unionist voter. As you can see, the proportion of no supporters who are willing to vote for the SNP or supposedly the Greens, and again, all these figures don't take account into the fact that the Greens are not fighting most of the constituencies. The average unionist voter will not touch the SNP with a barge pole. This is fundamentally different from the position in 2011 when the SNP got an overall majority. Then they got 40% of support from unionist voters. The SNP's difficulty, however, is that they don't command the yes side of the column in the same way as they did 5 years ago. So far, they've only been getting in 2/3 of the vote. There's some signs that they're beginning to pick up some of the support from the Greens, who would otherwise vote for the Greens on the constituency vote. But still, there's still some fragmentation of the yes of yes support. And this is where the SNP's record in government and the fact that it doesn't have such a charismatic leader, all of these things begin to make a difference. Now, of course, what you really want to know is not all this crap. What's going to happen in terms of seats? And of course, you might be thinking, well, I suppose the SNP are going to do pretty well, but presumably it's going to be a hung parliament, question mark, question mark. The thing you have to realise, although Scotland supposedly has a proportional electoral system, 73 of the 129 seats are elected by first past the post. And right, if you are that far ahead with a geographically evenly spread vote, which the SNP vote broadly here is, you're basically just going to go walkies everywhere. The vast bulk of the constituency seats are going to go to the SNP. And all these projections, which are based on MRP polls, which are now being undertaken for the devolved elections for the first time, these are really big polls, statistically analysed, come up with an estimate for what's happening in every constituency. And 2 of the 3 we've had so far have actually put the SNP at 67. John Swinney has set getting 65, which is what you need for a majority, as his target, though he seems to be beginning to row back from this in the last 24 hours. But he's certainly saying if we get a majority like we did in 2011, we should be able to have an independence referendum, as we did after 2011. Why is this? Well, basically, to cut a long story short, notice how few seats the Tories are expected to win, particularly under these 2 projections. And what you can go on to show using these MRP polls, and this is arithmetically almost inevitable, support for the SNP as for the Tories is falling above all in places where they were previously strongest, which means that the 5 seats, 1 in the northeast and 4 in the borders, that they're trying to defend are more vulnerable than you might imagine from the polls. If the SNP can pick all of those up, they might just get over 65. But the Liberal Democrats are, however, the other crucial potential barrier to the SNP. The Liberal Democrats seem to be doing relatively well in the places they're trying to defend. Not entirely clear from this, but they're also doing quite well in the places where they're targeting, which includes 3 constituencies in the Highlands and Islands. And if you think any opinion poll can tell you what's going to happen in a constituency in the Highlands and Islands, where politics is very, very local, then you need to change your ideas. And so the risk for the SNP is that the Democrats will indeed pick up at least 1, maybe 3 seats in the Highlands, and that will stop them getting an overall majority. The irony of all of this is, of course, it's not the Labour Party who at the moment are best placed to deny the SNP a majority. It's the Liberal Democrats and the Tories, those also-ran parties, which, however, have certain local concentrations of votes outside the central belt of Scotland, which could determine whether or not the SNP get to 65. In contrast, More in Common said, oh, no, actually they had support for the SNP down. And the crucial thing that More in Common then said, you know what? If the SNP are down to about 32%, which is what they have, virtually every seat in Scotland becomes a marginal, and best of luck at forecasting. Finally, Wales. Well, Scotland does at least look as though it's going to keep the same government. We're just not quite sure whether it's going to be minority or majority. Wales seems to be heading for, well, a phrase that was used actually in the wake of the 1999 devolved election, which is now undoubtedly justified, an earthquake. Labour have not lost an election in Wales, well, depending on how you calculate it, since 1931 or even since 1922. The polls have consistently been putting Labour third. Some have been putting Labour a very poor third. Meanwhile, the party that was second to Labour in Wales, in 2021, the Conservatives, also now well down. Here's a really clear indication of what Jane's talking about. The two parties of the Conservative-Labour battle has been replaced in Wales by a battle between Reform and Plaid. That said, what's also true about Wales is that it's changed its electoral system, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Now, in contrast to Scotland, Wales is still 2-1. If you just simply ask people whether they vote yes or no to independence, it's still about 2-1 in favour of staying inside the Union. And it's very, very difficult for Wales to get the kind of data I showed you for Scotland as to how yes and no voters would vote. But basically, the crucial point to note is that if you look at the green bars, which are the views of the people who say they're going to vote Plaid, only around a half of them are in favour of independence. Quite a lot of them will be happy with more powers. But conversely, in contrast to Scotland, Conservative and Reform voters will be quite happy, many of them, to say bye-bye to the Senedd. So in a sense, Wales is more divided on the constitutional question, but actually its relationship with party support is weaker than it is in Scotland. So what might we expect in Wales? Well, Wales is moving to a party list system, 6 MSs elected in each of 16 constituencies, using the D'Hondt rule. Ask me afterwards if you don't know what the D'Hondt rule is. This is a poll from YouGov that actually had the two parties, Reform and Labour, and Plaid virtually neck and neck. It came out with Reform possibly getting 1 seat more. It doesn't matter very much. Notice again how few seats there are for the Tories. Why? Well, 1, because you need to get about 12% of the vote to get a seat in Wales, and 2, you've got it, the Conservative vote is going down more heavily in the places in Wales where they were strongest in 2021, particularly in places like Flint and Clwyd. That does mean that, frankly, it doesn't matter who comes first. Because remember, the First Minister has to be elected. There will not be enough MSs to elect a Reform First Minister. So, as Steve said at the beginning, look forward to all 3 devolved administrations being run by nationalist First Ministers. The first law of politics is the law of unintended consequences.
So Ben tells me that the vote is in 6 minutes and he won't be able to join us until 6:15. So Stephen, if you could share your thoughts with us now. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for those fascinating presentations. I thought, as the only person who doesn't do any polling, I would talk about, I would answer the useful question, which I think often people have when they look at these things, which is, okay, are these polls right? Thinking,
which ones?
Thinking about, I've been to all of the places that these elections are being contested this time, thinking about the various elections where the polls have been right and the polls have been wrong. You do almost always get hints. In 2015, it was, so Bob Hayward, the pollster, says, first look at the polls, then go out and try and talk to some people to stress test whether or not you think what you're seeing is about right. In 2015, it was pretty obvious that there were more Conservative voters than the polls suggested. According to the polls, there were a bunch of people who said, I prefer David Cameron and George Osborne to Ed Miliband and Ed Balls, but I think I'm going to vote Labour. You could find these people in the polls, but you could not find them anywhere in the country. In 2017, according to the polls, there was very little enthusiasm for Jeremy Corbyn. Wherever you went, it was very easy to find quite a lot of it. But in every other election I've covered, you've looked at the polls, you've gone out, you've talked to people, and you've gone, yep, seems about right. I'm afraid this time I'm going to give you the boring answer, which is, yep, the polls seem about right. There's an interesting parallel, I think, in both Scotland and Wales. And in both Scotland and Wales, you have incumbent governments that people think do not have a particularly good record. But in one of those places, the incumbent government is being sharply rejected, and in the other one, it's going to be re-elected. I think
Still rejected. It's still rejected.
yeah,
That's the crucial point.
and still sharply rejected. This is the thing is that mostly particularly when you go around not for a party but just as a journalist knocking on doors, after a while you know how people are going to vote before they tell you, because you've had so many conversations that you can start to join in with the chorus, as it were. The fascinating thing about this set of Scottish elections is you really can't tell until the end, unless they tell you at the start whether or not they are voting for or against independence, because you get this kind of litany of, oh yeah, they're dreadful, they're awful, but... Now, I think the interesting thing in terms of the question about what's going to happen at the end of this Parliament is if I were a Labour MP looking for crumbs of comfort, I would look at a government whose delivery record is pretty bad, that has had to cycle through not one, not two, but 3 First Ministers, and yet is on course to be re-elected, and I would think, I wonder if this might be a movie we see again. Because I think the really interesting thing about the fragmentation story, as someone who's not a pollster or sociologist but has covered more elections now than I care to count, I like to think about 2 people who I've met while travelling the country, and one person who I met one person who lives in the block of flats that I returned to at the end of the day. The first is a woman who I met in High Peak, which is a perennial marginal in England, who said to me, so I met her in 2023, and I asked her, we're talking about various political issues, and I said, how do you think you're going to vote? And she said, well, we need change, so it'll be one of the 3. And it was one of those things where at the time I didn't think anything of it, because what I hadn't absorbed is it didn't even occur to me that I needed to ask what she meant by one of the 3, because I think we all know that by one of the 3 she meant Labour, the Liberal Democrats, or the Greens. Now, I haven't managed to find this woman again, despite going back to High Peak, but I would be willing to bet all of the money I own that this woman voted Labour in 2024 and is voting Green in 2026. Now, the big political essay question is that type of voter, that person who goes for one of the 3, are they in 2029 going to wake up the morning after the general election and go, oh God, I really didn't want Nigel Farage to be Prime Minister. God, who saw that coming? I have to be honest, I doubt it, because thinking about a man I met in 2024 who'd voted Conservative in 2019, what he said is, I need change. But he did not say, I'm voting for the 3. He said, we need change, so, the Tories need a rest, so I'm going to vote Reform this time. And I think sometimes when we go, there's only inter-block transfers, we forget that people do understand that the different options in the block mean different things. All that happened in 2019 and 2024 is there were a lot of intra-block transfers. People who voted Lib Dem in 2019 voted Labour in 2024. People who voted Labour in 2019 voted Lib Dem in 2024. The big difference is they did so in ways which got rid of the Conservative Party. And that didn't happen by accident. People who voted Lib Dem in 2019 did not do so under the mistaken illusion that Joe Swinson was going to be Prime Minister. They did so because they did not want a Labour government and essentially wanted a deniable way of not getting it. And ditto in 2024, people who voted Reform did not, for the most part, do so thinking they were going to end up with Nigel Farage in Downing Street. They wanted a deniable path to not having a Conservative government. And indeed, one of the, as Jane says, her and Martha's great chart shows a long-term trend, but it also shows a fascinating trend every time there's a change of government from Conservative to Labour. There is a group of Conservative voters who just go missing. They vote for the referendum party, they vote for UKIP, or they stay home, right? But the one thing they don't do is they don't switch left to right. And I think still, in some ways, right, this is kind of the fascinating irony of this stupid thing we did called Brexit, right? Which is that every election since, we've proved we are a normal European country. What do we have? We have the normal European distribution of a tired and tattered centre-right party, a tired and tattered centre-left party, a party of the far right, and a party of the far left. And what has tended to happen at every actual election is when people get to the moment of decision, whatever happens, they're not going to be surprised. Now, I'm not saying that and therefore we can predict exactly what's going to happen, but I think we can say that we sort of know what the question will be, which is people will either go, actually, I need to stop Farage, in which case they will make a viability judgment. Now, I'm not going to pretend I know what people will be using for viability. If what they're using for viability is who runs my council, that is going to be a very differently coloured map than if they're using who won in Westminster last time. But I will say the one bit of polling that I do not believe, the one bit of polling that I think has been systematically been shown not to be what happens when people get into the voting booth in every by-election we've had thus far, is that you'll get this clown car of, a shattered progressive bloc and a shattered conservative bloc. Because what has happened in every single by-election, the conservative vote has been squeezed essentially down to nothing, to a type of conservative voter you meet all the time who basically dislikes Nigel Farage, dislikes the economics of the left bloc, and is kind of therefore stuck in a slightly weird loveless marriage with Kemi Badenoch. But I also kind of want to offer my final thought, which I said is about someone else on my estate who, like me, is an ex-council leaseholder. And I don't know if there are any other leaseholders in the room, but the thing all leaseholders do when they meet is they complain about the council. We complain about, the service charges and the repairs, and we're always on the hook for everything, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, the thing that's happened in London politics is that, broadly speaking, exactly as James set out, the most economically straitened voters have, broadly speaking, gone to the Greens. They are the party of private renters and social renters. And the Labour Party, in some cases, because it can count, and in some cases just because they've realised that there's nowhere else to go, have suddenly decided they actually quite like leaseholders. I think because we're all frightened of being even more on the hook under the Greens. And what I've noticed about this person I talked to in the lift is he's gone from, in February, going on about how much he hates Camden Labour, to deciding, I need to stop having the green leaflets make it very clear that they don't like ex-council house leaseholders. So he's actually become quite enthusiastic about Camden Labour. Still hates Keir Starmer, but he's become really quite enthusiastic about his choice. And I think that is a useful way to think about that SNP score, which is that, broadly speaking, voters talk ourselves into being more enthusiastic about the decision that we're going to make. And I think the interesting thing to watch as we find out how people are going to choose between that question of, is the next election about stopping Labour or stopping Farage, is I think the first hint is they will start to sound more enthusiastic about one or the other of them. And I think the trend to watch is going to be the approval ratings of Nigel Farage and whoever the Labour Prime Minister, whoever she may be. Anyway, I think that's quite enough from me. Thank you very much, and thank you for those really interesting presentations.
So Ben's not quite with us yet. So can I invite our panellists to take their seats at the table here? Does anyone have any questions for the members of the panel? And just to remind you, the event is being recorded, so please wait for the microphone before you start actually asking your questions. There's one at the back there, and then we'll have somebody here.
Thank you, Stephen.
Thank you. Very, very interesting talk. I have a vote in Wales, and I've been looking at the seat projections from some of the latest polls. And it's clear that Reform is going to be doing quite well from the projections that have come up in those South Wales Valleys areas, which would have been traditional Labour areas, and certainly, were strong for Labour in the last general election. And you were talking about voters actually staying in blocks when they transferred across. And my first thought would be, why is that happening in South Wales then, that the vote is going to Reform rather than Plaid, which is concentrated more to the west and the north? And I just wondered also whether there was a sort of that there was also in places like Sunderland and Middlesbrough, where UKIP had been so strong and where the Brexit vote was so strong, whether that was a factor as well in the way people were voting.
Thank you. While John answers that, can we move the microphone to this man here? Yeah, John.
I'm afraid I'm going to slightly question the assumption of your question. The polling data in Wales indicates very, very clearly that Reform are crucifying the Conservatives and actually taking less from Labour than they are in either England or in Scotland. And Labour, in contrast to the position elsewhere, are being crucified by Plaid. They're not actually losing that much to the Greens, although they're losing some. And they're losing a bit to Liberal Democrats. It's very, very sharply within Wales, quite to a remarkable degree. What you then have to remember is that if you can crucify the Tories at the same time that Labour are being crucified by somebody else, you might end up emerging in the top. And I think it's one of the things to understand in general about what will happen in some of these local elections. Again, and this takes me to Sunderland, etc. Now, what is true is we know that the traditional quote-unquote Labour vote in places like Sunderland and Barnsley, where it looks highly likely that Reform may well take control of the council, the Labour vote in those areas is less pro-EU than it is, for example, in London. So the character of Labour's coalition does vary geographically. And the folk who've gone from Labour to Reform are overwhelmingly people who voted for Brexit, because the people who vote for Reform are overwhelmingly people who voted for Brexit. And the people who have gone from Labour to the Greens and the Liberal Democrats are primarily those people who voted Remain. So the way in which Reform can put together a winning coalition in somewhere like Sunderland is, first of all, first base, and this is always Reform. First base is indeed to get the Tory vote on their side, right? And there's still enough of it in Sunderland to give you a base. Then on top of that, because of the Labour coalition in Sunderland is somewhat more pro-Leave, it's somewhat easier for Reform to pick up votes from Labour amongst that group. And then if Labour also then lose votes to the Greens, bingo, Reform can be well ahead. But in general, although it's true that I'm almost undoubted in the local elections, Labour will end up losing more seats to Reform than they do to the Greens. That does not mean that Labour have lost more votes to Reform, right? The consequence of Labour losing a lot of votes to the Greens and Reform picking up a lot of votes from the Conservatives can be Reform gaining a seat from Labour.
Thank you. Jane wanted to add, I think, something.
Yeah, one thing that's really important to say here, and it is really counterintuitive, it's hard to get your head around, because you hear someone like Nigel Farage coming on the telly after general election night in 2024 and saying, we are going to park our tanks on Labour's lawns. And so they look like they're going to, they're essentially saying we're going after Labour voters. But actually what they mean is they're going after Labour areas. And Nigel Farage's prospects for actually getting significantly large numbers of Labour voters are very, very slim. Now, why is that? Now, one of the other things that's really important here, and this is, your question is kind of gets to the nub of why Labour's been struggling as well over the last year and a half, which is not just in Wales, but in places like Sunderland, seeing that Reform threat in places and then sort of overweighting the Labour to Reform switches and then taking for granted its vote on the left. Yeah. But as John says, what has to happen is Labour's vote just has to go down, Reform's has to go up. It doesn't matter where, like Labour's vote can go down because its left vote is less loyal, and Reform's vote can go up because the Conservative vote is squeezed more. And that is going to make that tip to Reform look like a tip from Reform.
I mean, again, remember, a principal foundation of Labour's large parliamentary majority is the fact that Nigel Farage took a barrel load of votes off the Tories. Right? And therefore, it reduces the threshold that Labour needed to get to start winning seats.
But just the one other point I want to make is that this has happened over time. So when we talk about blocks, this is not like we're just talking about blocks now, right? Because it's a really helpful way to understand things. But it's also because since Brexit, those blocks have looked more different. And the likelihood, therefore, of switching between blocks has gone down. And however, but if you think in your mind's eye that a Reform voter is a working class voter who's very disillusioned and upset because of their local economy, you'll think about the Welsh Valleys, you'll think about Sunderland. But you're thinking, we're thinking about a Labour voter of old. We're not thinking about a Labour voter since 2017.
Yeah.
And since
Crucial.
2017, and indeed actually somewhat before, the Labour vote just became more coalesced around the Remainy, socially liberal left voter. And so those blocks have become more distinct, and it's Labour's vote, therefore, going left that can do all of that harm, but as you said, make it look like Reform is taking votes from Labour when they're not. But it has caused Labour a ton of stress over the last 2 years. That's the Morgan McSweeney strategy, and Morgan is no longer with us. Right, sorry Steve, I can't see you to shut
Yeah, I know. Can you hold your thoughts? Because we do have Ben, I think. Now, I don't know whether you guys want to shuffle around or go back into the seats. Ben, can you hear us?
I can indeed. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you. Thank you very much. Hope do you have the outcome of the vote already?
Not yet, but there's still another 3 minutes to go.
Okay. So I know that you were trying to listen to some of the panel beforehand. I don't know what you caught. Maybe one crucial thing, John Curtice ended his talk by pointing out that he thinks there might well be a Plaid Cymru First Minister at the end of this election. What does that mean for how you're thinking about government formation and the future of Welsh nationalism?
Well, thank you, Stephen. And can I begin just by thanking everybody for their patience and understanding. I thought after 9 years in Westminster that I understood how the place works, and then clearly, with my timing being so out of it this evening, I don't. But yes, it's a very exciting time in Wales, and one of the things I've been reflecting on in the past year or so is just the renewed or surging interest in Welsh politics from outside Wales. It's not usually something that we're used to. We're not really used to having correspondents from international papers coming to do vox pops on the streets of Cathedral. And, did I say it very gently, they're not that accustomed with some of the major UK outlets taking a keen interest in Wales. And actually, I'm not going to complain about it because it's understandable. The story of Welsh politics has been one of Welsh Labour dominance. And if I begin by just giving you a quick whistle-stop tour of the history of Welsh politics and also some of the key sort of dynamics or patterns that have emerged in recent years, because they do explain or offer some invaluable insight into the formation of the ex-Welsh government in the new Welsh Senedd, and also for the future of Welsh nationalism. Because, as I mentioned, Labour in Wales has been the Rolls-Royce of political parties. They are unrivaled in the democratic world. They've won every single election in Wales for over 103 years. And they've been in power, top of the polls, for the Senedd elections, or the Assembly as it was, for 27 years. For those of you with an interest, I think the next two sort of rivals for that title of most successful political party in the democratic system, you'll have to go for the South Bavarian People's Party for 77 years, and the Christian Social Union, Bavaria, for 72 years. So they are way, 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 way ahead. And in the last general election, the 2024 election, they won 84% of the Welsh seats. However, despite that linear of continued dominance, there were a few alarm bells, especially those within Welsh Labour, were looking at the fact that they had only 37% of the vote in 2024. That's, I think, their fourth lowest vote share in Wales since they began competing in elections in Wales. And I think there are two main things that I would point out to explain their change in fortunes and potentially their loss in dramatic form now in a week and a bit. The first is that, at long last, Labour in Wales are paying the cost of government. I listened to Professor Curtice's speech there about the experience in Scotland. The SNP continue to defy political gravity in that regard. But in Wales, at last, gravity's caught up with Welsh Labour. And what you have is YouGov polling showing now the people in Wales, perhaps because of the COVID experience, are now blaming Welsh Government for any failures in public services. And unfortunately for Labour, people aren't that happy about the state of public services in Wales. So to give you just a quick snapshot, 67% of those polled by YouGov believe that services in Wales are deteriorating, and 64% now blame the Welsh Government. That's a big, big shift from recent years. And UK government used to get the blame for everything, whether it was fair or not. And the other key thing, and this will really influence the future of Welsh nationalism, is this question of identity, particularly national identity. Wales is quite a unique case in that 27% of Welsh citizens are born in England, and we have a whole host of key identity categories. We have Welsh only, British only, English only, Welsh and British, British and English, and a few others. But what we've seen since the 2016 referendum on the European Union is a massive shift within those who were Remainers. Those perhaps, the Wales Government Centre put it, those who perhaps are university academics, moved to Wales for work, they've increasingly dropped a lot of their affinity with the British identity. And what we've seen is an increase since 2016 of those considering themselves Welsh only, to the point now that that is the identity that tops the poll, if you like, for the first time since we started recording these things. Now, clearly, that offers an opportunity for parties such as Plaid Cymru, to some extent, the Welsh Green Party also. Jane also mentioned the reorganisation of politics, and it's just true in Wales. These two major blocks, and I suppose the Wales Government Centre would have you put them as the nationalist liberal bloc and then the British or more conservative bloc. And what we've seen in the run-up to this election is a real consolidation of the former by Plaid Cymru. The story is not Labour losing votes to Reform. If we consider the last YouGov poll, at least, when people were asked, 4.9% of 2024 Labour voters were going to vote Reform. 41% were going to vote for Plaid Cymru. And so it perhaps challenges certain understandings of Welsh politics, this idea that Reform is on the rise in Wales because of they're gaining Labour voters. That's not the case. In fact, it's the cannibalising the Conservative vote. 46% of whom voted Conservative in 2024 are now saying they'll vote for Reform. Interestingly, Plaid Cymru, as you might expect, is retaining some 86% of its 2024 vote. Now, if, and this is a big if, Plaid Cymru succeeds to consolidate that Welsh Liberal bloc of voters by squeezing even further the Labour vote and the Green Party vote, then clearly its path to forming a government becomes a lot easier. Now, of course, Professor Curtice mentioned as well, we have a new electoral system in Wales. I wouldn't say it's necessarily proportional in the sense that the D'Hondt formula does tend to reward the bigger parties. We'll go into that perhaps in questions. But this idea of trying to squeeze the nationalist liberal bloc of voters in Wales is a clear mission for Plaid Cymru. And despite this new system, tactical voting is something we believe could still be wielded as a bit of a weapon to achieve that aim. Now, why? Well, 60% of people in Wales were polled last month said they didn't understand the new system. But perhaps more importantly, of the 2024 Labour voters, those who said that they were considering voting for Plaid Cymru listed as their first reason is that they believe Plaid Cymru stands up for Wales. And the second is to stop Reform government. And that also feeds through in the question that was asked people by YouGov again, what would be their nightmare Welsh government? 62% said a Reform UK government. 47% said a Labour or Welsh Labour government. And then 57% of all those asked said that Plaid Cymru is best placed to stop Reform UK. Now, although the system doesn't really lend itself to tactical voting, it may well be the case at its first outing that tactical voting will be quite an important factor. And what we're seeing, both in terms of the canvassing returns and in some experiences through first past the post elections or the council and indeed the last Senedd by-election, is that if there is this strong perception that Reform are running away with it or that they are in a position to be the largest party, then there is that reaction from the national liberal bloc of voters. And so recent polls, which have projected Reform being the largest party, actually probably useful and quite helpful for Plaid Cymru's messaging in that regard. Now, the formation of the next Welsh Government, a couple of factors that I'm uncertain of how they will play out, but I think they are worth citing. The first is that if the polls are anywhere accurate, we will see a significant loss of experience in the forthcoming Senedd, especially from those with ministerial experience. Because of Labour's dominance, most of the former ministers would be on their benches. Between a combination of potential electoral loss and retirement, they're no longer going to be there. And if Plaid Cymru looks to form the next Welsh Government, it can only theoretically call upon the services of one former minister, Ellen Jones from Ceredigion, Pembrokeshire, and she was last in government in 2007. So there are big challenges in terms of actually getting to grips with the task of governing. On the flip side, you'll also have an inexperienced Welsh Senedd, a lot of new members of the Senedd, and certain blocks perhaps without their natural leaders and scrambling in the first few months to sort things out. Now, that's also an opportunity for a Plaid Cymru government, especially in the scenario where it might want to lead some sort of a minority administration. But what is clear is that contrary to the constitutional question in Scotland, the constitutional question in Wales is very different. Nationalism in Wales is a different creature. There is a great deal of emphasis placed on accruing more powers for the devolved government in fields such as the Crown Estate, the fiscal framework, borrowing powers, indeed the power to set new taxation bands. These are the things that feature very heavily in the public debate in Wales when it comes to the constitutional changes. And perhaps it's little wonder, therefore, that Plaid Cymru, under the leadership of Trinity has modified, shall I put it, our ask when it comes to the Constitution. There is no denying that Plaid Cymru would like to see an autonomous Wales. However, for this election and for any first term of a Plaid Cymru Welsh Government, it's very much about getting on with the day job of trying to improve the standard of public services. And to do so in order, as the rugby expression would go, to earn the right to go wide. If you show that you can govern well, then people may, just may, trust you on the bigger questions of Wales's constitutional future.
In the West, so we have officially run out of time, and some people clearly have to leave, and that's totally fine. I think hopefully on the technical side we can carry on for another 5 minutes or so. Yeah, we're okay. Can I just quickly ask, does any of the panel want to say anything in response, or ask Ben a quick question? No. In which case, we did have a question over here.
Thinking back to the comments just before, Ben, you joined us, within the movers on the right block, the people who are moving away from the Conservatives, are they being attracted to reform, or are they being attracted to Nigel Farage? And with the movement on the left, is it a movement from Labour to the Greens, or is it a movement from Labour to Zach Polansky?
The answer to you, I think, is that people are going from, insofar as they are from Conservative to Reform, because of Nigel Farage, i.e. Nigel Farage is the person who is able to sell his party effectively, and equally Zach Polansky is the person who is ensuring, but through his strong charismatic leadership, that people are being persuaded to go from Labour to the Greens. So the leaders are undoubtedly crucial. And I mean, it's very, very clear in the case of the Greens. I mean, the rise of the Greens doesn't wholly date from the advent of Zach Polansky as their leader in September, but it does virtually wholly. And of course, another part of the whole story we've got, and this is where the crucial contingent factors, it so happens that our two challenger parties have two charismatic politicians leading them. And meanwhile, amongst the rest, there's a certain dearth of political talent.
So I think Jane wanted to add something. Jane, do you want to stand up? Because I just realised you won't be on camera otherwise.
Oh, yeah. Hello, camera. So one thing, if we think about what happened in 2024, we have Reform, doing exceptionally well for Reform, right? But actually, since then, what you also have, imagine you're a Conservative voter who wants to vote for another party on the right, but doesn't think Reform is a viable option. What you've seen since is a greater deal of, a greater degree to which reform is seen as now, actually, I could vote for them and they might actually win. And so I think also what's happening, and we never know, John's right, of course, that leaders are really important, but we can't tell that empirically. We can't tell that with evidence because it's very, very hard to disentangle all the factors here. But, I just want to say the two other big things, though, are that reform looks to those right voters who perhaps didn't think the reform had a chance in 2024, now like a party that they could vote for in order to stop a party on the left. The other thing in work with Justin Robinson and Zach Grant that we're finding is that the Tories, they're still being punished. It's very unusual for a party of opposition to not be benefiting when the main party of government is losing support. They're still jettisoning support because of their governing period. The economy is not going well, and there are many people we find in our new analysis is that there are many people who are now not giving the Tories a reward or even punishing the Tories because they see the economy not going very well, as well as punishing Labour. So it's not just a story about leaders. It's not just a story about charisma. It's context, it's failures in government, but then spinning over into new choice sets within those two blocks. Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe we've got time for one burning question, and there are several burning questions. The lady here with the black top.
Hi, I was wondering what makes reform more attractive to voters now rather than in previous years?
I didn't catch that.
Actually, Stephen, would you like to field that? If I remember rightly, the question is what makes reform more attractive now than last year? Yeah.
So I actually think in some ways it's quite a simple story in that generally in the first term of a new government, people understand that most of the problems that the government is facing are the fault of the previous government, and they're therefore inclined to give them the benefit of the doubt. In this country, we do mostly re-elect the first-term government. The point I occasionally make is that a parrot trained to go, the government will be re-elected, is outperforming literally every commentator in my industry. So, next time you should just get the African grey, and they'll just sit there going, the government will be re-elected. And what often happens when the first-term government struggles, we saw this in 79 to 83, where the Thatcher government, we forget monetarism did not work. They essentially have to come up with a new alternative economic policy, while they were in office. What happened? The alliance surged in the polls, and I think a large part of reform success is people, broadly speaking, they look at the people who crashed the car, who are curiously unrepentant about, there's a quite overpoweringly smug energy coming from the Conservatives about Labour's difficulties, and I think loads of people look at that just as they looked at Labour in the 80s and went, I'm not sure about this one, and they looked at a fresh alternative, and I think that is essentially what we're seeing with reform. Now, of course, there's the added complexity that people are clearly more scared of reform than they were by the SDP, or indeed, in the 90s and noughties when people felt annoyed with New Labour, they voted Lib Dem in mid-term. I think the interesting variable is people are attracted to reform, there are people who, including people who voted Conservative last time, who are quite scared of them, and we just don't know how that plays out in a general election because we haven't ever done that bit. But I think this bit is actually quite an old story. It is just failing first-term government, unrepentant opposition, people turn to a third party.
And on that note, thank you all very much to our panel, to Ben online, and thank you all for coming.